Okay, so you like group up all the mobs, and then once they're all grouped up, you drag them across the room and you click on an item. The item is a chain. And so then you extend the chain and it stuns all of the mobs and it kills them and it blows them up in one singular pull. And you gain most of your count in the dungeon doing this. The dungeon being described is Neltharus. And so if you've done Neltharus this season, or have you seen players do Neltharus in like a pretty high level key, you understand like what is going on or what is being talked about. Where you would pull 20 to 30 mobs at a time, try to group them up as easily as you could, and then you would all click the chain simultaneously and blow up the trash pack, kind of similar to what we did here. And if you notice, in the bottom right here, we have a damage meter. And the damage meter says, damage done. All of us, I would say, cumulatively did 9 million damage to that pull. And the chains did, 135 million damage to that pull. And the time that it took to just basically group the pack up on top of the chain. Whatever that was, 45 seconds, something like that. Now, the Neltharus chains have been nerfed. And while this is something that we're going to talk about a little bit, I think I'm also going to talk about like buffs and dungeons and like how that's affected the game and like just generally give my thoughts on that, because this video is not necessarily just about the Neltharus chains nerf, but also about like the future of what buffs and dungeons should look like, because I think it's pretty clear that Blizzard enjoys stuff like this, or they enjoy, things like this, because they continue to bring them back over and over again. So, first and foremost, let's talk about the nerf itself, because I think that's probably the most important thing. The Burning Chains nerf has rather large impact. A lot of enemies can no longer be hit by Burning Chains at all now. This separates the mobs in Neltharus into 3 different categories. Mobs that can trigger and be hit by chains. Mobs that cannot trigger the chain, but can be hit by the explosion effect. And then mobs that cannot be hit by the chains. So basically mobs that before, only very specific mobs could trigger the chain, but pretty much every single mob in the game could be hit by the chain, which was, it was definitely weird, to the point where mobs such as the birds that were pretty clearly not supposed to be getting hit by the chain were getting snapped into it, where many bosses I think were definitely going to get snapped into it at a certain point. And if you take a look at this clip here from Kess's live stream, you can see what something like this is going to look like, right? Where he's in the upper wing area, and he's going to be tagging a bunch of mobs, and then he's going to activate his Wormstone and snap all of the mobs back. And we hadn't seen how this had fully evolved in the TGP, but if you were ever going to deploy a strategy like this, it was going to be a pretty massive thing, where you'd utilize the Wormstone, and then every single mob, just snaps to you here. And so this was a strategy that was never really fully utilized, but I think if they left all of the mobs to where they could trigger the chains, you were going to see some weird shit in the TGP where all of the mini bosses, everything was going to be getting hit by the chain or blown up by the chain. So now, the mobs that can trigger the chain are the Hunters, the Trainees, the Bone Tenders, and Lahar himself, which is the mini boss that patrols up and down the wing towards the Forge Master area. Type 2, the mobs that can only be hit by the chains, which are the Phoenix and the Wardens. The Wardens are the mobs that do the frontals, and the Phoenixes, of course, are the birds. And then pretty much everything else can no longer be hit by the chains at all. This includes the Apex Blazewing. This includes, the Bone Splitters. This includes like the Lava Bears. Basically every other mob. Essentially, it seems that everything that isn't in Chargat's area, plus the Wardens, can no longer be hit by burning chains. And so Squishy states that the impact of the season, it will definitely slow down groups, as many groups would pull at least one pack from the Magma Tusk trash to the Burning Chains area right away, and then the bird pack in the middle at the end of the dungeon. This will definitely impact the top routes. This will definitely impact like top routes more than most other players, but this is not something that is going to be like super impactful. If I had to put a amount of key level differential on this, I would say that for at least top level groups, this affects your key maybe a level at the most. I was thinking more about half a level, but I think the big thing is that it allows you less room of leeway for like mistakes, because you would see teams consistently time this key with like a full wipe randomly. And so I think that those days are kind of gone because you're going to have to do things like kill the apex bird and just kill a bunch of other random stuff with your hands. And so I think the timer's getting a little bit more restrictive because of it. I would say so. Just like this is like a mock-up route that I was making after the changes to try to see like what something would look like. In general, you're still going to have like a majority of the damage of the whole entire dungeon dealt by the chains. I think that there was going to be some TGP runs though that were snapping 100% of the mobs in the dungeon into chains, and I think that that probably affects their keystone level by probably 2 or something like that. Whereas for more, I would say more average high-end players, I would say it's probably like a half a keystone level to a full keystone level. And then for casual players, I would say it probably affects your keys 0 because you weren't really utilizing the chains properly anyways. Now, chain nerf aside, let's talk about just external damage buffs and things that do damage to the mobs themselves. I think that there have been a history of a decent amount of these things in the game. I think Synths did a good job of compiling it, where Neltharus, 42% of your damage in the overall key. This includes bosses, this includes everything. 42% of your damage in the overall key was dealt by chains. Whereas Toldagor Cannons, which is number 2 of all time, only had damage contribution of 28.2%. So, you know, that's a pretty steep differential. If you think about how OP Toldagor Cannons were, Neltharus Cannons were almost twice as strong. And then you had things such as Siege of Borealis Spotters, Junkyard. This is Shadowlands Season 4. I think BFA Junkyard's shock bots were much more impactful if you really go back, where the dungeon was virtually not doable if you didn't have shock bots, whereas if you had shock bots, it was doable all the way up until a 40 or whatever. And then you have Necrotic Wake, where 17.3% of your damage was the weapons, because those ended up getting like target capped a little bit, where it did reduce damage after a certain number of targets. A lot of the weapons did. And so I think that something that these dungeons have in common are these strategies are very dominant, and the strategies are not particularly fun. And I think that they end up causing a lot of issues whenever these are the dominant strategies for how you're supposed to progress the dungeon just in general. And I think that, so just talking about like how this ends up working out and just kind of like the way that the chains end up defining like how you're supposed to play the dungeon, I think that they are not healthy for the state of the game for how you were playing the keys. I think that like in general, your damage should be a large majority of like what's going on in the dungeon. And I think that buffs that do this in a good way are like the Algathar Academy buff. If you think about AA's buff system, where you zoned into the key, you grabbed a stat buff at the very beginning that was related to what type of aspect you just wanted to be attuned to, and then you got a stat buff relative to that attunement, that was cool. And it does speed up the key, and it does some cool stuff for the key. And I think that ways that it's done incorrectly is the Neltharus chains here, where your whole entire strategy around doing the dungeon is devised around the chains. In addition to that, I think it makes the dungeon always inherently imbalanced, because is the dungeon timer going to be balanced around these chains, or is the dungeon timer going to be balanced around not doing a chain strategy? And that, I think, really impacts players' ability to be able to play the dungeons, especially at like a high level, but even at more of a casual level. So think about Siege of Borealis. Siege of Borealis was a dungeon that was designed around the timer being relevant for you to actually have to use a spotter to be able to time the key, where all the other dungeons that I had listed earlier which were like what, Junkyard, Toldagor, whatever else, all of them, if you utilized the cannons or utilized the Necrotic Wake weapons or any of that other stuff in an effective manner, then you were able to time the key at multiple key levels higher. And so like it didn't really matter. And so that, I think, is just like a significant problem whenever you have things like that happening, because it creates an imbalance in how the dungeon is going to be balanced. What is the timer supposed to look like? I think that in general, I hate mechanics like this. I think that my character should be doing the damage to the mobs in the dungeon, and I don't think it should be requiring a very niche strategy to do all the damage to the mobs in the dungeon. I think Neltharus is already like this. I don't think it's something that they should just completely remove the chains now, because it's too late in the season. But I think in the future, Blizzard needs to stop designing dungeons like this. I think that they're just not fun to play, and I think in general they're toxic for just game design in general, because it's impossible to balance how these dungeons are going to be played. Overall, though, I am glad to see the chains are nerfed. Again, I don't think this is going to impact too terribly much. I think this is going to impact like TGP level teams, but I don't think it's going to impact like how you're supposed to normally pull this key. I think this is still one of the easiest dungeons of the season because of how the chains interact with the mobs and the fact that chains are still going to contribute, 35+%. Okay, so we got nerfed from 42.8% to 35% of your damage in the key. It is what it is. Overall, though, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts down in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next video.